In today's episode of the Brisbane Property Podcast, we are going to be exploring technology and artificial intelligence and the impact that they are having on the property buying journey. We're going to explore the pros and cons of relying solely on this type of information versus getting some local expert knowledge. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Welcome to the Brisbane Property Podcast with your hosts, Melinda and Scott Jennison.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Brisbane Property Podcast with Scott and Melinda Jennison. And for our listeners, I don't know if you'll notice any difference, but we've relocated offices, and this is our first podcast in our brand new office.
Yes, new podcast recording studio as such, set up permanently for the purpose of recording these weekly episodes. So we hope you continue to enjoy the podcast episodes as we continue to collate the research and analyse what's happening across the Brisbane market to provide you with those weekly updates. We've certainly had a consistent growing audience over the 4.5 years since we've started this podcast. So we're very grateful to all of our listeners for continuing to support the podcast because, without your support, we just simply wouldn't continue to go.
So today's episode, this is an interesting one because how the world's changed, really. I remember we've talked about it, I think, before, and it probably shows our age a little bit. When years ago you'd look to buy property and you'd meet a real estate agent and you'd probably read the paper actually initially and find out some properties for sale. Real estate agent would pick you up in his car and take you for a drive around and you look at some properties. Nowadays, tech and AI, what sort of influence that is having on the way that we buy a property, and we're just going to go through some pros and cons.
Yes, of course, the way we buy property has changed significantly since the introduction of the internet. I would say that was the first big change. Of course, having online platforms readily accessible to all buyers right now makes that opportunity of searching for properties a lot easier for many people. And in fact, we've seen a huge increase in the number of property buyers that are relying solely on the likes of the internet and artificial intelligence through other sources and data and technology to make purchasing decisions. So we're going to be going through pros and cons of relying solely on all of these resources that are available to us versus not only relying on those resources, but also having that accurate eye look at a property because, we strongly believe that AI and data and advancements in technology will never fully replace the human involvement in selecting the right property to buy. So we're going to really, run through the pros and cons of relying on all of these data sets and AI devices today.
Yeah, and I think the key word there is solely. Obviously, there's data and there's research that's done, and we do a combination of the data, the research, the physical inspections, so a combination of everything. But the word that you touched on there, Melinda, was solely relying on the data and the AI side of things for the making that decision.
And I think the reason that this is something that is very important to us at Streamline Property Buyers is because we really do advocate for local area specialisation. And, one of the things that we need to ensure as property buyers that we are providing is an understanding of the local nuances around a property. I've also covered in many previous podcast episodes some of the limiting factors that come into play when considering property data as such. Now, just to run back through some of that information, of course, a lot of property data is reported to some of these research firms from sales agents. For example, things like days on market, quite often these sorts of indicators, which many people use to determine the speed of a market, can be dependent on the accuracy of the reported information. If we look at days on market, for example, here in Brisbane, because a lot of properties do sell by private treaty sale, are those days on market measured from the point at which the property is available online through to the point at which a contract is entered into? Or are the days on market measured up to the point at which the contract becomes unconditional? And that information is not yet clear because when we do see days on market reported at a suburb level for some of the properties that we buy, we can certainly see a difference between what we're experiencing in terms of the speed of the market and how quickly properties are going under contract versus what that days on market indicator subsequently tells us when that data becomes available. And usually the days on market number is higher than what we're actually seeing on the ground. So that can really influence the accuracy of relying on just one source, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, to be honest, because we could look at every single indicator to determine the pros and cons of, how that is measured. And I guess that comes from my research background and the reliability of the data that we're relying upon. It's so important to understand how that data is being collected so that we can have certainty and confidence in being able to rely upon it to make purchasing decisions. And I see huge value. And in fact, I love data, and I advocate for understanding data and really being able to use it effectively. But there's nothing that is actually more important or more valid than what you're seeing on the ground. And that qualitative information that we're collecting by being out and about is so much more realistic and so much more accurate compared to what might be reported in settled sales information.
I guess that's a good combination. You love the data, and I like physically looking at the properties. When we look at data and AI, obviously they cannot fully capture just the subtle details around the property, around the surroundings as well. So when we're talking about things like infrastructure projects, community dynamics, and also things like upcoming developments in the area as well, they're not things that they can fully capture as well.
At this stage, that's correct. Now, of course, there's other resources that would be available to us through online searches that can be used to assist us in understanding, what projects might be happening in the local area in terms of infrastructure. Also, we can get an understanding of what development approvals might be in place, what developments might actually be commencing, so we can understand how that area might change. Again, these are resources that would be available through online searches. But community dynamics are going to be much harder to capture. So, for example, how do we determine the community feel? Data is very unreliable in being able to capture emotion and to capture the lifestyle elements of a particular location. So, of course, we understand with property that the majority of property buyers are actually home buyers, and they're not purchasing for investment purchases. They're actually purchasing for their own lifestyle requirements. They're purchasing for shelter, and they're buying a home. So their drivers for why they might be choosing a certain location or a specific property type or even a specific area within a suburb, that's going to be very subjective, not objective. And what I mean by that is subjective information is much more difficult for data and AI and technology to capture. And this is where that local understanding of what makes an area desirable or what makes an area a community area, it really does come into play.
I think that's a really good point when you talk about that, understanding the community side of it. As you say, when you look at the data and the AI side of things, they can tell you a certain about a property and the location, and maybe some surroundings, tells you maybe there's some coffee shops and things like that in the area, but it can't tell you that the locals like to get out and play cricket on the road, for example, on a Sunday, or have Sunday drinks with the neighborhood, or so those little things that are really subtle about how a neighborhood lives and how people in the area live. It could be the coffee shops, but you might not know that a certain coffee shop is different to others. So there's different areas there which really become that emotional, personal type of thing, as opposed to the data side of it, because it is non-emotional.
And, here at our team at Streamline Property Buyers, without a doubt, the data will lead us to a particular region or a particular suburb. But in fact, once we get to the suburb level, data stops there. And then it becomes local knowledge that helps us to inform our clients in terms of which parts or which segments within the suburb are more desirable than others and why. And that's where that local knowledge and that community understanding really comes into effect. Now, whether you are a home buyer and you're wanting an understanding of the way that community lives, or whether you're actually an investor and you're wanting to capitalize on what appeals to those owner occupiers in the area the most, obviously, the more appealing the property and the more that it actually appeals to the dominant buyer group, the lower the risk of the asset that you're selecting as well. Because if you do ever need to sell, you want your asset to be able to appeal to all segments of the market. That's owner occupiers as well as investors, and not just limit your resale to a small investor segment of the market. So these are the things that we would always look for, and understanding at a local level the pros and cons of different parts within a suburb becomes a critical selection process, so part of the selection process.
So, Melinda, if I'm looking at a neighbourhood, for example, and I want to know a little bit more about that neighbourhood, will data and AI help me with things like supply and demand and those types of things in those particular suburbs?
Look, it certainly will. And supply and demand metrics can absolutely be measured. You can measure the number of properties that are available for sale. You can measure the number of properties that are being built. You can measure the number of properties that are being approved for construction. So these are all indicators of supply within a market. You can also measure the vacancy rate in a particular area or the number of properties that are available for rent at a particular point in time. So these are all data measurements that are absolutely available to be measured. Same with demand metrics. You can measure things like population growth movements. You can measure the local economic indicators. You can measure employment indicators. These are all things that can contribute to demand. You can also measure other elements of demand, which may include the number of people relocating from interstate versus the number of people that are relocating from overseas. So you can become more granular even with those population movements. But what you can't measure as effectively through data is those emotional elements of property buying, those lifestyle elements, those reasons that people want to live in an area that are not related to a particular number. And that's where local market knowledge and understanding those local nuances becomes more important. People know that for example, a specific school catchment area might be more desirable than others, but getting an understanding as to why, that becomes that local knowledge. And that's something that, a good local specialist buyer's agent should be able to share with their clients if they're looking for a specific location, whether that's an investment or a home buyer.
I think one of the really, really big things that we do probably see here, which data and AI can't actually understand, is the condition of the property.
Mm-hmm.
So to have that physical inspection, to actually walk through it and physically see and touch and understand how the property is and smells, looks, feels, all those types of things. You can go into a property and it could be quite damp, but you won't know that unless you walk in there, and you can smell dampness. You can see mold or things like that. So that physical inspection and the condition of the property, there's wear and tear. There could be hidden things that are unknown when you open up a cupboard and all those types of things. They're a really critical thing when it comes to making a decision to buy a property. And that's something that I don't think can actually be replaced.
No, and some would argue that you can still enter into a contract and rely upon a building and pest inspector to provide you with a report that will identify some of those issues associated with the wear and tear or the structural integrity of a problem. And of course, that is possible. But there's not a building and pest inspector that I have met to date that will provide you with an understanding of that neighbourhood. For example, whether there's old cars rusting in the nearby neighbouring properties, whether there's a terrible smell that drifts through the neighbourhood, from 3 till 6 p.m. every afternoon because of the direction of the breeze and because of the surrounding neighbourhood. These small things can only be detected by physically being at the property. The other thing is that if you are, for example, a property investor, it's absolutely critical that you understand the current condition of the property. Here in Queensland, of course, we now have minimum housing standards in place for tenants. And what that means is that if you are going to purchase a property and provide residential accommodation for a tenant, the home must actually meet minimum housing standards. So you must know the condition of the property, and if there is a scope that is required to improve that property condition to enable it to be rented, it's important that you understand that upfront before you buy, so that you're not actually surprised when you've settled on a property and the property manager comes in and says, look, there's going to be $10,000 worth of work because of all of these issues that we've identified, not necessarily items that would be brought up in a building and pest inspection because there's no structural issues or water ingress issues, but these are small items that mean they must be repaired before the property is tenanted. And of course, again, that's why a physical inspection becomes a critical component and a critical piece or part of the due diligence process to ensure you're actually aware of the thorough condition of the property as well.
I think between the physical inspection of the property and understanding the property, how it looks, as well as the emotional side of it as well. Now, you touched on when you said about a building and pest inspector not being able to tell you the certain neighbourhood around the area as well. There's so many little things that we do talk to our clients about, and that's when you're living in a house. depending which way the breeze comes from, for example. So in Brisbane, gets hot, I should say, in summertime. So that nor'easterly breeze, and having something that can actually bring that nor'easterly breeze in, trying to avoid the western sun if the house faces that way, is there cover? Do the trees or the hills behind it block it? Those sort of things. So having that physical inspection to understand just those little things. But when you live in a home that, you start to cook in summertime and you've got the air conditioning running all the time, your electricity bill goes up, all those types of things. If you can avoid that and you pick up a nice breeze where you can sit down and have a glass of wine and a cheese platter on a Sunday afternoon on the deck, they're little things that are so important to people. And they're the things that you can pick up if you know the area and you're local and you do that physical inspection to actually understand the property and how it feels. So obviously the condition of it, and that's when I touched on the emotional side of it, how the property feels. Does it feel comfortable and warm and comfortable as a home where you want to live? Even if it's an investment property, because people want to live there. So you've got to understand how people want to live as well and make sure that it really touches on those side of things.
Yeah, I think you've actually brought up a really good point there. It's called the emotional appeal of a property. When home buyers especially walk into a property, they feel an emotion, and a lot of them feel comfortable, or they feel at home, or they feel warm, they feel secure. These are all real feelings that home buyers get. Now, equally, a tenant that lives in a particular property wants to feel something as well. So you won't get any of that understanding from an emotional perspective in terms of how that property feels. And I think that part of the process of understanding property is that you need to understand how it might appeal to a tenant or how it might appeal to an owner-occupier. And that's part of the role of a buyer's agent, to really articulate some of that information that a buyer wouldn't be able to obtain on their own unless they had someone like a team of professionals physically inspecting that property for them. Of course, buyers can do that themselves by attending properties in person, and we always encourage people to do that and not just rely on photos supplied, or even there's some very great, very high-tech sort of videos and walkthroughs that are now being provided by some agencies. They'll never actually fully capture the feel of a property, and that's why we always encourage a physical inspection as well.
I do love that when we talk about the physical inspections, and I love it when you see photos on realestate.com when all the ground's wet and it's been obviously raining or is raining, and yet there's beautiful blue sky in the property. It's quite funny when you see that, and then you go to the property and it's not sort of what it looked like in the beautiful photos. A little bit of photo touching up can be done. Obviously, that's where that physical inspection comes into play. The other thing that it does rely on and can have a little bit of you can't rely on the trends and how properties have performed or are, might be predicted to perform as well. I remember we did a podcast a while ago, and it was a lot about gentrification. And that's something that it's not going to understand. What is this suburb like now? How's it changing? What's it starting to look like? Are you getting the little microbreweries pop up in the area, the coffee shops and all those types of things? Is that something that it can't know and obviously predict how that is? Whereas if you're actually local here, you can see those changes. Suburb from suburb, how they're changing. Is there knockdown rebuilds happening in the area? Is it starting to gentrify, and is it starting to change? And it will change, obviously, and over the years.
Yeah, that's, an over-reliance on past trends can, certainly be a bias within data that actually comes through, or even in AI that might be predicting what's likely to happen in the future, because it is relying on past performance to predict future performance. However, in a city like Brisbane, where we have a lot of infill development that is yet to come, it's so important for property buyers, to understand where that infill development is coming. And, data doesn't actually capture that future potential supply pipeline, whereas people being able to overlay that with the data can actually provide a much higher level of understanding of what Brisbane's going to look like in the future, not just what Brisbane looks like today. So future market shifts, that having that human element to get an understanding of where different pockets of development are likely to come in the future, along with what's happened historically, will provide the greatest assurance for property buyers so that they can understand not just what's happened in the past and what's happening right now, but what could happen in the future.
What about local council changes and regulations? I mean, what sort of influence does that have Can it be noted? Can it be found out on when you start to look at property? How do people know if there's going to be changes in restrictions and laws and council side of things?
Yeah, so at the moment, a lot of the artificial intelligence tools are able to sweep a lot of research-based websites to predict whether properties might be impacted by, flood zones or bushfire zones and things like that. What they can't do is I guess, get an understanding of where the future development is coming, how things might be changing on a day-to-day basis. Because remember, AI is really sweeping historical data, not data that's being released, right now. So there's a lot of cons associated with relying purely on that information, because here in Queensland, for example, we have an updated Southeast Queensland regional plan that's going to be driving changes to local city planning schemes at some stage in the near future. And that obviously drives regulatory and zoning changes. Now, we've even heard with the upcoming state election here in Queensland that the Liberal government have proposed some fast-tracked zone changes should they be elected to assist with fast-tracking future supply. So again, there's a lot of policy changes that, data and AI would absolutely not be able to pick up right now, because they're happening right now in real time. And if you're relying purely on the information that's available through these other resources, without also overlaying that with current trends and current information, then you could be actually making a mistake that could negatively impact you over the longer term.
It's interesting when we look at different areas and we look at demographic trends and things like that. Also looking at things, and I know that there's searches you can do when you start to look at noise overlays, whether it's from main roads or from train lines, planes, all those types of things. But sometimes that can be a little bit deceiving, and you can look at a property and say, "Oh, look, it's in a noise overlay. It might not look at that," but the physical inspection can actually be quite different. So you could actually go to and again, we're back to that physical inspection side of it, but actually going to a property and listening what it's like inside the house where you live most of the time, in the backyard, things like that. At the front yard, you could pick up a bit of noise, but that might not worry some people. So again, it's the noise levels, the community events, all those types of things, the lifestyle around that property, which can have a big influence as well.
Yeah, and some of this research that is available and the data that is available and even some imagery that is available, it's not current as at today's date. So, even understanding the neighbourhood character, being able to drive down the street today and get a snapshot view of what that neighbourhood looks like, it might have looked different the last time Google captured those images or any other video surveillance or photo surveillance sort of AI technology captured those neighbourhoods. And therefore, if you are making a decision today, you're really wanting to understand what things look like right now, not what they might have looked like a couple of years ago, because a lot can happen in the space of 2 years in some neighbourhoods, and we're seeing it all the time. We drive some neighbourhoods and we marvel at how quickly houses are removed and then new houses, are there in their place, or houses are lifted and renovated, or, houses are extended, new pools going in. We see this in real time, and we see those areas where people have still got the capacity to spend money on their homes. And of course, this causes gentrification of the area. But there's very little AI or data that would be able to capture this in real time. And this is why, I guess, combining both AI and data with on-the-ground research makes the most sense.
I guess the AI and data wouldn't pick up if people are looking for a neighbourhood that's big on Halloween. I know we're coming up to that, and I know people do laugh at that, but some people don't want to live in a street that the places are covered in spider webs and Halloween things, but yet some people with young kids, that's what they want. They would love their kids to be in those sort of neighbourhoods. Again, we can drive the streets where we are, and I can probably pick out most of the houses that actually are covered in that Halloween stuff every year. Some people love that, as I say. Some people say, I don't want that around my neighbourhood. So again, they're the little things, understanding those personal, emotional side of property when you start to look at it, when you start to pick it out as well.
And I think, little things that can be discovered in an inspection, like the workmanship of a particular renovation. We're seeing more and more, new builds come to the market. When I talk new builds in the areas that we buy, typically they're older homes that have been knocked down and they've been rebuilt, or alternatively, they're character Queenslander homes that have had a significant renovation performed. So effectively, they're a new build, but for the the structure on the top level. And we see a huge variation quite often in the quality of those builds. Now, of course, if you've got a neighborhood where you've got similar sized properties on similar sized blocks, but at very similar quality levels, that does impact on value. And a lot of online resources won't actually display that difference. A lot of the AI resources available won't actually be able to distinguish between that difference. Whereas, seeing this in real time certainly helps us to understand the difference. And that's where we're able to advise clients as well. So if you're on the ground, please make sure you are doing that physical inspection or engaging someone to be able to do that on your behalf. An extension on that is that if you are working with a buyer's agent, whether that be here in Brisbane or anywhere, please make sure that buyer's agent is physically inspecting the property on your behalf, or that you understand what provisions they have in place to physically inspect that property for you. Because here in Queensland, if you are purchasing property, the person inspecting the property shouldn't just be an acquaintance of the business. They must be licensed to inspect properties on behalf of buyers. So they must hold a real estate registration certificate here in Queensland, or a full license for real estate here in Queensland. Otherwise, they're acting outside of the law. So if you are partnering with someone who may not be based here in Brisbane or in Queensland, and they are physically inspecting properties but using a third party to do that, make sure that business does use licensed providers, because otherwise that may expose you to liability or liability risk or lack thereof. The other thing is that I'd always be questioning if a buyer's agent is asking a property manager to do that inspection on their behalf. And it does happen. It happens more frequently than I'd like to see it happen, because I always believe that a property manager has a vested interest in actually securing that property management. That's worth quite a lot to them. So if you've got a property manager that's inspecting the property that you're looking to buy, and then you're going to hand over that property management to that property manager, there could be a conflict of interest there. So it's important to understand how that conflict of interest is going to be dealt with. And I'd ask those questions up front. But the preference would always be to have someone that's completely independent. And if you are engaging a buyer's agent, make sure that buyer's agency are completing that full scope themselves in-house and not outsourcing parts of that scope elsewhere.
I think apart from the making sure that the property is what you're after. So when we're talking about the emotional side of it and how it feels and how it looks and all those types of things, when we touch on and again, it's a lot about the physical inspection itself. You talked about poor workmanship, and we mentioned dampness and mold and things like that. There could be electrical, plumbing, all those types of things. Again, they're the sort of thing, it's going to cost you money. At the end of the day, whether you're a home buyer or whether you're an investor. Melinda touched on earlier about the minimum standards that are required now. So making sure that there's curtains, make sure the doors and the windows all lock and secure correctly. There's regulations that you actually have to comply with. So for a tenancy agreement, you need to actually make sure that they all do comply. And if it doesn't, it's going to cost you money, and it's going to cost you money up front straight away, and possibly ongoing maintenance money. So they're the sort of things that you've really got to make sure you look at, you check. And obviously, if you've got that building and pest inspection, there's another check. But they're the sort of things that you really, really have to understand when you're looking at a property as well.
And I'd like to just sort of probably wrap up the discussion by talking about the importance of that local buyer knowledge. And what I mean by that is there's nothing more accurate than real-time information. And that real-time information is obtained by being out on the ground, observing what is happening today. So that is being on the ground on a Saturday and turning up to open homes and seeing how many people are turning up to view those open homes. It's also being on the ground to witness and experience auctions in real time, to see how many people have registered, how many people are actually bidding, how frequently those auctions are passing in. And if they are passing in, is it because of a lack of buyer interest, or is it because the vendor's not meeting the market? These things combined with data become very powerful in being able to make very accurate recommendations, because remember, data is always looking in the rear view mirror. I prefer to be looking out of the windscreen, heading forward and not looking backward. And of course, that's the way we at Streamline Property Buyers will always be advising clients. It's taking a forward looking approach, not a rear view mirror approach. Of course, data guides us to certain areas and certain locations, but it's that real-time information that we are able to collect by being out and about on the ground every weekend, understanding those emotional factors that do contribute to that purchasing journey, whether that's a home buyer or an investor. Whilst we don't make emotional decisions for investors, it's important for us to be able to advise our investor clients in terms of what might appeal to the owner-occupier in that particular target location, so that we have a risk mitigation strategy in case someone does need to sell, and not being over-reliant on trends or artificial intelligence. We absolutely must embrace the way that we are heading as property buyers. It's so important that we understand what is available to us, what tools we can use, but we must overlay that information with the information that we're collecting by being out and about inspecting properties and inspecting those neighbourhoods.
Perfect. So if you need help, apart from the AI, reach out to the team at Streamline. We're always here to help and have a chat. So look, I think that's been good information. As we said, it's not relying solely on one form or the other. It's the combination of the data, the research, the due diligence, the physical inspection. It's a lot of money to spend on property, so you don't want to make a mistake. That's probably the biggest thing that we look at, and we help our clients to avoid making any mistakes as well. So as usual, I will let Melinda wrap it up. From myself, take care, and we'll talk again next week. Thanks very much for listening, and bye for now.
Thank you once again for joining us on the Brisbane Property Podcast. As always, if you have enjoyed this episode, please share with friends and family. We would love for you to leave us a review on whatever platform you're tuning into today. Until next week, we hope you have a good one, and we will speak to you again then. Bye for now.